Hey everybody, and welcome to the inaugural edition of the Carpe podcast. This show is dedicated to helping you live a happier, healthier, and more fulfilling life. I'm really excited to bring you a conversation that I had with Donald Robertson. He's the author of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor and several other great books on Stoicism. We talk about how you can incorporate Stoicism more into your everyday life. We talk a lot about the life of the Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Donald's super funny, he's really entertaining, he's incredibly smart, and he gives us a sneak peek of some of his upcoming projects. This is a conversation I promise you do not want to miss. Thank you so much for stopping by, and remember, seize the day. Ladies and gentlemen, Donald Robertson. Donald Robertson, the author of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, one of the best books on Stoicism that I think you can find today. Thank you for joining me today.
Cool. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. It's a pleasure to be here.
So would you mind giving us just a short synopsis of your background just for the audience's benefit?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit of a long story, but I'll give you the very concise version. So originally I'm from Scotland, as you may be able to tell. I now live in Canada. I'm in Nova Scotia at the moment. I studied philosophy, and after I did my philosophy degree, for some reason, just by chance really, I kind of wound up doing my master's at Sheffield University in integrative psychotherapy and philosophy in a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary department. And that was basically how I got interested in the relationship between Stoicism and psychotherapy. So my background originally was in academic philosophy. And then pretty much after I graduated, I trained as a counsellor and psychotherapist, and I worked in many different modalities in many different contexts. I was a schools counsellor for a year. Actually, I don't normally talk about all the stuff I've done because there's a lot of things, it's quite varied. But I was a schools counsellor in South London for like a year or two, and had a Harley Street clinic for many years. And mainly I started off doing psychodynamic counselling at first and studying Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis. And then I completely abandoned all that. And my focus very quickly, early on, became on Stoic philosophy and cognitive behavioural psychotherapy. And that was, I don't know, like over 20 years ago, and I've never looked back. And so now I write books about philosophy and psychotherapy, and I run courses on it, and I travel around giving talks. And I'm one of the founding members of a non-profit organisation called Modern Stoicism that was founded by Christopher Gill, Professor Emeritus of Ancient Thought at Exeter University in the UK. And so Modern Stoicism has an annual conference and runs big online courses that tens of thousands of people have completed around the world. And we have a multidisciplinary team of philosophers, psychologists, and classicists. And so I'm kind of involved in all of that stuff.
Man, that's so you kind of done a little bit of everything.
Yeah, I think I've been incredibly lucky. When I started off, when I was a young guy, I really thought my life was kind of going nowhere. I vividly remember really assuming that I sort of dropped out of school and stuff, and nothing much was going to happen. I lived in a small town, and somehow, kind of by chance and stuff, I've ended up over the years doing a lot of varied stuff. At the moment, also by chance in a way, for the next year or so, I'm in the middle of it at the moment. Where I'm writing a graphic novel that we've just finished the initial drafts on. It's about Marcus Aurelius and Stoic philosophy. And I know nothing about comics and graphic novels and stuff like that, but somehow I just wound up doing this. And now I've had to learn, I've had a crash course on how to design comics.
Yeah, I saw that project on some of your social media. How has that been trying to transition to that medium and that different form of storytelling? You're a very good writer, so definitely.
Let me just grab something from the floor, actually. Just give me 1 second to grab something. See if my cable even reaches.
Awesome.
Oh, there you go. This is the graphic novel.
Wow.
Right. Oh, these are the drafts of it, right? So we're in the middle, so we've got a bunch of stuff done. Oh, I can show you. The whole thing's going to be colour. I don't know if you would be able to see that very clearly. But these are drafts. And then there's like somewhere in here. Yeah, at the back. You probably can't see that very clearly. But that's black and white actually, but the page is done originally in colour. It's painted. So that's what they find. The finished artwork's going to be more like in that style. Like at the moment, we just have these pencil drafts, so we go over the wording and the kind of sketches, the outline, the storyboard, or whatever. And that's quite a long process. And so it's been going well. I mean, I guess what I can say, I've always felt that you don't have to do this to do Stoicism, by the way, but I always felt that, like many of the misconceptions, I'd love to think that every disagreement in philosophy could be settled by rational debate. But I know from experience as a teacher, I ran a training school for psychotherapists for many years, that I was known for sort of standing and arguing with therapists. I just found myself doing that. It was at a time when CBT was controversial. So I would run training courses and people would come and train in, and psychotherapists are quite argumentative. So they would argue with me a lot about CBT and stuff. And now I kind of look back and think, oh, they all agree with me now, like, because it's kind of become more the thing. But I noticed from a lot of these debates that, often what wins an argument isn't logic. It's pointing to maybe a particular type of example, or you learn from experience that there's a particular thing that you can say that will generally like win an argument on a particular theme. And with Stoicism, there are a handful of common misconceptions about it, right? And so one of them is that Stoics are kind of passive. So if you accept your fate, you would just kind of like be a doormat, sit on your hands and sit around and do nothing. You'd be kind of politically passive and inert, some people think. And they go, well, this is all about acceptance, what we should be rioting in the streets, not just kind of accepting things. And then the other misconception that people have is that Stoics are kind of like, what's his name, Mr. Spock in Star Trek. They're like robots and they're unemotional. That's my little impression of a robot. But so that's another misconception. And you can sort of go, well, if you look very carefully, that's not exactly what the text's saying. So you can debate about the translation of the Greek or Latin and the meaning of the text, or you can debate about the wider philosophy. But especially in social media, that usually goes around in circles, right? And the easier way to settle those debates is what I call, here's one I made earlier, right? Where you go, here's a Stoic I made earlier, right? So here's an example. Like, here's Marcus Aurelius, right? Did he sit around doing nothing? Obviously not, right? He was a workaholic. And he did amazing things in his life. Marcus Aurelius, apart from anything else, was known for burning the midnight oil. Like, he had a reputation for staying up into the wee small hours. He was obsessed with the bureaucracy of running Rome. And when push came to shove, what we know him for, in a way, is fighting these wars, the Marcomannic Wars, kind of series of wars, like a chain reaction of wars in a way, on the Northern Frontier that went on for maybe like 12, 13 years altogether, in the middle of a pandemic 10 times worse than the one that we are currently facing, right? Which went on for that entire period, right? It didn't go away, right? It continued, the outbreaks continued for the entire duration of the Marcomannic Wars. In the middle of that, he's fighting these wars. He had no military training whatsoever, right? There are a bunch of reasons why he felt he had to leave Rome. He'd hardly ever left Rome before. He travelled to Austria, to Serbia, like along the Danube, and stationed himself in the front line. Took command of 140,000 men, if you can even visualise that. Like, the largest army ever assembled, apparently, I'm reliably informed, on a Roman frontier. And when he left Rome with his general's cloak on and military boots, he'd never done this before. And he was sickly. He was coughing up blood and having dizzy spells and stuff like that. He struggled with the cold in Austria, in Carnuntum. So he didn't interpret Stoic philosophy as being about just going with the flow, man. Just kind of, so what if these guys are invading? We just have to live with that. He took disciplined, courageous, and determined action, and he did it very systematically and very strategically, and he put himself on the front line in the face of danger. Actually, notably, his son Commodus bailed. So he thought, Commodus basically said, it's too dangerous for me to be here. And as soon as Marcus died, Commodus left the front line and went back to Rome because he thought it was safer there. So we could look at other examples of Stoics, but writing the graphic novel allowed me to take that idea a step further. That we view Stoicism differently when we actually look at it in slightly more concrete terms. And it's important because, like I say, people on the internet argue all the time about these common misconceptions of it, and you can argue till you're blue in the face. But if you just kind of visualize the guys that wrote these books, then it opens the door then to going, well, clearly Marcus wasn't a very passive doormat guy, Why wasn't he? Because that's not what the philosophy teaches. Chrysippus said the wise man will engage with public life if nothing prevents him, right? The early Stoics also said the wise man will have an affinity for writing books that help other people. So they'd be prolific bloggers today or whatever, right? If they were Chrysippus, 100% would be blogging like crazy. Like, he wrote over 700 books. Right, you're not going to tell me that he wouldn't be churning out articles on the internet all the time. Chrysippus was an obsessive writer. So, writing the graphic novel, to come back to the question that you actually asked me, I think, the graphic novel takes that a bit further, because I thought, okay, well, let's talk about this example. And in my mind, I'm now visualizing Marcus Aurelius and ancient Rome and putting things in historical context, and so it all means something a little bit different. But now what happens when we actually paint it on a page? I went to Carnuntum. I spent a week there, and I interviewed the CEO of the museum there and the head of research at the Carnuntum Museum, where Marcus's legionary camp, his legionary fortress, was based at Carnuntum. So I kind of immersed myself in it. And I wanted to kind of absorb things. There's an odd thing about the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, which is part of the reason that it's popular. And I think a lot of people maybe wouldn't realize this at first. One of the reasons that book is so popular, because there's something quite odd about the style in which it's written. And I'm not talking about, there are several odd things about the way it's written. It's not just that it's aphoristic. It's not just that also Marcus uses a very extensive vocabulary, interestingly, very different from Epictetus, although Epictetus's books are actually written by Arrian, who's a highly accomplished Roman statesman and a great writer, but he deliberately chooses a very limited vocabulary to express those ideas. Marcus has this extensive vocabulary, like Shakespeare or something. He uses lots of words, sometimes unusual words and phrases to express himself. Maybe that doesn't always come through, perhaps, in English translation. So, but there's something else that's odd about it, and it's the absence of something. Marcus virtually never says anything in that book, or only in a very oblique or vague way about his historical context. You wouldn't imagine that he's writing it by the banks of the Danube, like in the middle of a massive military camp, right? In the middle, he never mentions, not once in it, does he mention the war that he's currently engaged in as he's writing it. He talks about war in very vague, abstract philosophical terms as a kind of metaphor. He says life is warfare and a sojourn in a foreign land, which many scholars have said, well, that's really strange because he turns it into a metaphor. But actually, he was in a foreign land. He was in Austria for the first time, very different climate for him. And he was engaged in war. His life was warfare from that point onwards. But we lose sight of that. So that allows us to project ourselves into the book. The most famous passage in the Meditations is the start of book 2, when Marcus says, every morning when you arise, tell yourself that you're going to meet ungrateful people, sycophants, meddlers, traitors, all that kind of good stuff. Everybody knows that quote. But when we read it, we think, yeah, that guy that sits across from me at work, he's meddlesome. And I don't really, that guy in the corner shop, I think he's shortchanged, he's a bit shifty, right? So we kind of project ourselves into it because it's very vague. And yet, Marcus, when he's writing this, is facing the prospect of a civil war. He's surrounded by court intrigue. He's got issues with his family. The fidelity of his wife is in question. The Marcomannic War happened because the northern tribes broke their long-standing peace treaty with Rome. So they lied, and they conspired, and they attacked Rome when it was vulnerable. And so Marcus was a diplomat, if you like. A lot of his time was spent negotiating with tribal chiefs. And so all this stuff is immersed in his historical context, but he leaves all of that out. So we easily forget. And I think there are advantages to that. It allows us to put ourselves into the book more. But then maybe the price we pay for it now is that there are some aspects of Stoicism that we kind of lose sight of a little bit. Like, I think some of these misconceptions that people have about Stoicism would be rectified if we could go back in time and look at Marcus actually writing this book and understand. So Marcus says, it adds a kind of colour or flavour to the book, a poetry to it when you place it in its historical context. Marcus says that it would be as ridiculous to wish that bad men don't do bad things as it would be to get angry with horses because they're neighing or with babies because they're crying. Now, there were thousands of horses stabled near where he was based at Carnuntum. There were huge cavalry units of maybe thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of Roman cavalry nearby. So he would have heard a lot of horses. Maybe sometimes he was writing, he thought, I can't get to sleep because I can't concentrate my writing because there's all these horses like passing through. And he says, when we get attached to material things, you might as well set your heart on one of these little birds that's there for a moment and then suddenly flits off and disappears over the horizon. Well, at Carnuntum, where he was based, of course, there are many little birds nesting in the bushes by the side of the river. And so these things, he says, suddenly take on a vividness, and they become more flesh and blood when we kind of paint the scene. And I think parts of the story change. I didn't realize when I began working on a graphic novel, I'll tell you one little odd thing about it, for instance, that may surprise people. We realize this kind of partway through, and now we're kind of more aware of it, and so we're kind of massaging it to fall into line with us to some extent. So some people have said, is this aimed at young people, like kids, because it's a comic, right? Now that's kind of insulting to people that are into graphic novels. A lot of graphic novels are very mature, right? They're definitely not suitable for kids.
Yeah.
The story of Marcus Aurelius' life, when you map it out and you picture it visually, there's quite a lot of it that resembles a horror story. And I'm not joking. So we were writing it. Thought,
not wrong.
This is a horror story. Like this bit, and this scene as well is like a scene from a horror film. Some of it's supernatural horror that actually becomes quite integral. If we are a rationalist, sort of agnostic, nevertheless, like a big part of the story is that Romans had prophetic dreams and they believed in religious retribution, and so you can't tell the story without bringing that into it and saying this is what they believed was happening. Like they thought the plague was caused by the god Apollo, and they thought it was because one of their legionary generals had ransacked a temple. So that's part of the story, right? We might think, well, that's just superstition, but it's part of what was going on for them. It's part of what he had to deal with. And I guess from Marx's point of view, he was a bit more of a rationalist, right? And then actually there's some signs that he wouldn't have believed in this. But nevertheless, he has to deal with it and make concessions to it because the people that he governs, for sure believe it. And so he's got to deal with the fact that this is a very highly sensitive issue. It's hard to imagine, but it becomes easier to imagine. I think it's hard to imagine when we're reading Marcus. But then when we put it on a screen or on a page and we picture the imagery, it becomes a little bit easier to go, I get it now. He's standing in front of, say, a temple and saying this, of course. So it takes on a different resonance. And the guys that he's talking to, half of them are religious fanatics, maybe. They really believe this stuff. So yeah, okay, I get the dynamics a little bit different than we might assume when we're just sitting at home or reading on the internet today.
See, so that brings me nicely into, you answered a lot of the questions that I had queued up here, but I think brought another element into it. So obviously, you look at Marcus's life and there's a lot that might kind of parallel what's going on right now with, he had to deal with the Antonine Plague, he had to deal with civil war, right now we're dealing with coronavirus, probably not nearly as serious as the Antonine Plague, but still definitely something that's affecting people's lives in a big way.
Uh-huh.
Dealing with political division, dealing with things like that. But there's that other element that we add into it with the media and with social media and with the constant flow of information and the fact that everybody's opinions are always available and they're always loud.
Hmm.
How do you think Marcus would have dealt with a situation like that? How do you, as a Stoic, deal with this kind of constant bombarding of information, and how do you kind of tune it out while still trying to get your message out there?
Let me say something about the context. First of all, like you're right, when we look at the Antonine Plague, and I think this people will realise this, he only mentions the plague once in passing in that book, and he says something kind of almost dismissive about it. But when we picture it on the page, we realise how big a deal that was and how many parallels there are. Because viruses are all different, pandemics are all different, but there are aspects of them that tend to actually follow a very similar pattern historically. One of them is that the outbreaks are often worse in the winter. Like that's pretty common. Like, and there are many things we could maybe learn to anticipate if people just look more closely at the history of pandemics. And social unrest typically follows pandemics. Often there are law and order problems, and military escalations. The Marcomannic War happened like, immediately after the plague because the Rome's enemies thought the legionaries are all dying of plague. Let's invade. It's been the perfect time. So, if you look at it, it's not good news, by the way. There's some kind of quite scary things but there's one or two kind of positive things that emerge. So we can learn things by looking at the history of the plague. Now, the reason I mentioned that is what you said about social media. People often ask me about that for a couple of reasons. So one is there are particular demographics of people that are into Stoicism. So we know from the publishing industry and all the data on the internet and stuff, we know a lot about Stoics. We noticed some of these things early on, and now they're kind of confirmed by a whole bunch of data, right? So the people that are into it, like, people into Stoicism are not all male, but they predominantly are male. Like about 2/3 of them roughly tend to be male. But that's also typical of philosophy in general. So Epicureans are roughly 2/3 male as well, or maybe 3/4. Like it varies a little bit. So there's a bunch of demographic things. Now, one of the things we know is there's certain subgroups. People in the military are into Stoicism. Sports coaches are into Stoicism. Psychotherapists are into Stoicism. And then there's this weird demographic that some reason I really don't like the name of. I find it almost a little bit kind of condescending or something, but it gets used all the time. So there's the millennials that work in the tech industry demographic, but they're not all millennials. But there are a lot of people that kind of work in the tech industry, although loads of people nowadays work in the tech industry. But nevertheless, there's a perception that a large part of the demographic of people that are interested in Stoicism are people, particularly men, that are millennials and work in the tech industry, right? And perhaps because of that, a lot of people say, how can I use Stoicism to help me deal with modern technology, with the internet, with social media, and also with the kind of mainstream media and the kind of escalating craziness of the news cycle. Now, the reason I mentioned the parallels between the Antonine Plague and also the Athenian Plague, which Socrates lived through, incidentally, I wrote about recently the parallels between our situation and that, is that people also ask about social media because they say Marcus didn't have to deal with this. The Stoics didn't have to deal with this. This is a modern day problem. And I say, hang on a minute, hold your horses, because it's not, right? And I think it actually benefits people to realize there's a connection, a big connection, of course there is, that we probably tend to overlook. And I'd sum it up as follows. Facebook, right, social media in general, is the modern day equivalent of the Sophists. So Marcus lived during a period called the Second Sophistic, when Hadrian in particular, who is his adoptive grandfather, and other Roman nobles got really into this kind of resurgence of Greek oratory, and sophism or sophistry was something that was celebrated again. So the early Greek Stoics, Socrates, the precursor, were all about having to engage with the Sophists. And then again, during the Roman period, we see the Romans engaging with this idea of sophistry again. So the Sophists were orators. They used rhetoric. They weaponized language, if you like, and they competed for attention. Literally competed. Like, so they would give speeches, and the winner would get a prize, right? Like, for the best orator, and they were celebrities. So it's kind of overlaps with modern day celebrity culture and social media influencers and stuff like that. So today you're judged on how many likes you get on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. Like, the Sophists were literally judged on how many people clapped, like how big the applause was, and then that would determine how much celebrity they had, how much they got paid. They'd be competing against other rival Sophists. And Socrates says one of the most interesting things about the Sophists. He says, sometimes you guys sound exactly like philosophers. Because the Sophists would often quote philosophers. They would cannibalize philosophical discourse to take out little nuggets of wisdom. They talk about virtue. But Socrates says, but the reason you're doing it is the complete opposite of the reason that we're doing it. He said, you're doing it to get people to like you. Like, so you say the same stuff that I'm saying a lot of the time, and people think that you're philosophers. Some Sophists kind of were philosophers. There's not a sharp distinction in a sense between them. Particularly in the second sophistic, it wasn't unusual for someone to be a Platonic philosopher and also be a sophist. So, and they believed that philosophy was provided them with this kind of treasure house of quotable sayings and concepts that they could use as part of their oratory. But they were trying to win celebrity, and they did it by trying to use language to stir up emotions and thereby to captivate the attention of the audience, which is exactly what the media do today, right? They're in a war against each other and the commodity that they're trying to win is your attention span. They want you to watch them. They say, "Look at me, look at me." Don't listen to that guy, that sophist. Come and listen to me. Come over here and listen to me. So they've got to say stuff that's shocking. So, like, I better exaggerate some stuff, right? Like, I better say some alarmist stuff about the Macedonians, right? Freak people out. That'll get bigger crowds coming, right? And that's exactly, nothing's changed, right? It's the same, like, today. We have the same thing with mainstream media and social media, kind of constantly trying to freak people out, trying to stimulate fear and anger like crazy, using emotive language whenever possible and imagery to try and I watched a little thing just now about the protests in America and how kind of, like a lot of the news coverage was just full of people rioting and tear gas being fired and stuff like that. But there wasn't, I mean, inevitably in a way, because it's kind of boring to look at, there wasn't that much footage on the media of people just standing around quietly protesting, like, which is mainly what happened, right?
Yeah.
So, like, well, you get like the worst kind of fraction of 1%, and then that's rammed down your throat repeatedly, like, which completely distorts your perception of events, and it's polarizing. Like, it's like putting a magnifying glass under like a single tiny blemish on something, but that's what the media might do, that because it gets your attention by freaking you out. The Sophists did that as well. And the Socrates and then the Stoics wanted us to do the opposite. So how do we do that? Right? A bunch of everything about Stoicism in a way I would describe as counter-rhetoric, right, or anti-rhetoric. It's designed to kind of compensate for or counteract or deflate the effects of emotive rhetoric. So the Stoics wrote books on, Zeno wrote books on rhetoric. He said we should describe things more objectively. We should pause and put things in objective language, removing the value judgments and suspending emotive terms. So Marcus Aurelius says sex is just the rubbing together of membranes and the expulsion of a sticky fluid, right? So, like, he's practicing. He says, my emperor's robes are just sheep's wool, like one of the cheapest commodity, most common commodities in Rome. Like, it's just sheep's wool. The same material that a beggar's robes or like a cynic's, philosopher's cheap robes would have been made from, dyed in the most disgusting thing, actually, rancid extract from the entrails of a sea snail that was allowed to kind of rot and ferment. This Tyrian purple or imperial purple is one of the most precious commodities in the empire, but it was made in this one of the worst ways. One of the worst jobs in the empire was by hand picking out this disgusting rotting stuff from. So he said that this is all that I'm wearing, right? Napoleon said something really cool that's very similar to that. He said a throne is just a bench covered in velvet. Right? It didn't mean anything to me, right? But even today, you know, like you think about how excited people get about things because of consumerism and stuff, and really at the end of the day, you know, how much does a lot of it really matter? A lot of it's just branding and kind of like perceived value, and it's kind of superficial. So the Stoics want us to get right down to brass tacks and view things and describe things in more objective language. Many examples of that in Marcus Aurelius. The other thing they love doing is getting us to try and think about things in terms of the broader cultural, social, historical, chronological perspective, the view from above, right? So mainstream media, we know that strong emotions, and only really over the past 10 years or so, have psychotherapists and researchers in psychopathology become much more interested in attention. Because attention is an abstract thing. Like, it's hard to point at it. But there are ways that we can measure it. We've known for a long time. And also, to some extent, it's under voluntary control. It's like breathing. You have voluntary control over your breathing, but it's also an automatic process. You have some degree of voluntary control over your attention. Like, I can choose to look over there, right? But if an explosion happened outside, that would hijack my attention, right? So there's a competition between voluntary and involuntary attentional control. And attention can be narrow, or it can be broad, it can remain on something, or it can jump around all over the place. When we become highly emotional, one of the most predictable things that happens is that attention narrows in scope, right? The Stoics want us to broaden our attention, though. So I point out very simply that what they constantly ask us to do, and what you constantly see Marcus Aurelius doing throughout the meditations, is something that's simply and fundamentally antagonistic to the experience of strong emotions like fear and anger. Like this idea of the view from above and thinking about things in terms of the broader context. So that's another thing that we can kind of do to respond to social media, is kind of like, not allowing ourselves to get too absorbed in the imagery that's being thrown at us, but seeing it as just a kind of transient or fleeting thing that's part of a much broader context.
Awesome. Well, that brings me perfectly into my next question, which is, as a part of your kind of daily routine, or just on a daily basis, are there any specific Stoic exercises that you do? When you wake up in the morning or before you go to bed? I mean, I'm sure probably you're a journaler based on your writing ability. That seems like a natural thing. But are there any that do you do any kind of mindfulness meditation to help you ground your perceptions or anything like that?
The first book I wrote on Stoicism, I tried to list all the overlaps between Stoic philosophy and modern psychotherapy, mainly CBT. And I tried to identify as many of the psychological techniques as I could. And so the first thing I noticed was that there are, first discovery, most basic discovery, is there are lots of them, right? Of all the schools of antiquity, it's the Stoic school that lists the largest, as we say, armamentarium, or toolbox, people say today, of therapy techniques or psychological techniques. So I hadn't counted them. I went back years later and I went, hang on, how many did I actually list there? There are about 18, if I remember rightly, right? So they are roughly, some of them could be divided down further. Like, you've got to choose how much, but those are strategies rather than specific techniques. There were 18 distinct psychological strategies, therapeutic strategies that I identified in that book. Most of them had already been identified by Pierre Hadot. So there are like loads, and this is a problem for modern Stoics. So in terms of the practice, they don't really know where to focus. And I think you didn't ask me this question. Someone asked me this yesterday in an interview. So what's the future for modern Stoicism? And I would say we need to kind of clarify what we do, because we're kind of gradually getting there, but we've got kind of too many techniques now. And what I find is when you give people too many options, often they don't do any of them, right? So they just kind of paralyze. And what they don't do is skills training, skills acquisition. So when you say to people, if you were to say to people, like, Stoics do this every morning, right? Then people will go, okay, well, a surprising number of people will go, I'll just do that then, right? And if they do it every morning for months and then years, they get better at it. But if you give them 18 different things to do, they'll kind of like dip in and out, and they won't get better at doing any of them, because they won't really practice systematically any of them. It's too much. So the thing I think the future would be to kind of pare it down, and we did that in one of the courses that I designed for modern Stoicism. We have a course called Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience Training, where we try to kind of pare things down. And I probably actually do several things, but I do some of the things that are in that course and some of the other courses I've designed. So the two main components of it are cognitive and behavioural. So we do something with our thinking, and we do something with our daily routine or our actions. So there's a bunch of other things we can do, but the main thing I try to do is to practice cognitive distancing, and I guess you would see that as part of mindfulness practice in general. So I try to pay continual attention to the value judgments that I'm making and notice how those affect my feelings and actions, which is basic to cognitive therapy anyway, right? The Stoics call this prosoche. I like that word because one of my favourite places to visit is Athens in Greece. Hopefully, when the pandemic permitting, I get to go back there soon. But I didn't realize until I went there that in modern Greek, prosoche is a word that they use all the time on signage. So in ancient, it means paying attention. And Epictetus says that this is paying attention to our faculty of judgment. It's what I would call Stoic mindfulness. In Greece, if you have a guard dog, like an Alsatian, you'd have a sign, a picture of an Alsatian on it, says prosoche. Or in the underground, where in England they would say mind the gap, they'd have a sign that says prosoche, pay attention, be careful. It means attention, watch out, danger, right? And it reminds me of the philosopher Spinoza, who many people say was kind of a quasi-neo-Stoic, wore a ring that had the Latin word Corte on it. It means caution, be mindful, pay attention to what you're doing. So this is part of this kind of practice, but for Stoics, it's not mindfulness of breathing. It would be mindfulness of value judgments. And there's other components to it. So even many of these strategies intersect. So just to pick one at random that we mentioned earlier, I talked about what we sometimes call objective representation. So describing things in a kind of down-to-earth way without value judgments. That would play into prosoche, because by describing events in an objective manner, it makes us more aware of how we're perceiving them and the value judgments that we're imposing on them. So rather than just going, this is a catastrophe, I would go, well, no, I just spilled some milk and it fell on the floor, and I'm kind of, I noticed myself beginning to view it as a catastrophe, impose those value judgments on it. Marcus refers to this as separation of thoughts from reality. So separating our value judgments from reality, noticing that we're imposing them. So that's the cognitive side. And then the behavioral side is basically the emphasis on virtue, living in accord with virtue in Stoicism. So in a major component of modern cognitive therapy, particularly in the treatment of depression, is that we get people to schedule activities during the day that are consistent with their core values. So that's what we do in SMRT as well. And we would say there's a lot I could say about that, but basically, try and find time each day to deliberately do things that you can look at and go, oh yeah, that's like the sort of person that I would like to be. It's the sort of person that I might like admire, or like I'm doing stuff that I think is actually worth doing in life, even if it's just for like a couple of minutes. So if you think, what I really value is creativity. So you go, I've got this job. I work in a sausage factory all day, and I don't really have that much chance to be creative. But so what tends to happen is people will just give up on things completely, right? But it makes a huge difference, even if they just did. Even if you said, well, just spend literally 5 minutes, even if you're sitting on the toilet, or something on the bus. Like, what if you make a point and make yourself just write 2 lines of poetry every day? That small changes make big differences, right? So even if you're working in a sausage factory, right, there's a big difference between doing zero creativity and doing 2 lines of poetry every day on the bus. There's a world of difference. Like, even though it's only 5 minutes of difference and a modicum of effort, but we have to remind ourselves to do that, right? And of course, over time, we can expand on that and do more things that are consistent with our core values. But it doesn't have to be like a big thing. It's just that we have a natural tendency to go to the opposite extreme and abandon doing fulfilling activities altogether. So I try every day, and then the way we do that is to Seneca talks very clearly in On Anger about a technique that comes from the Pythagorean school of philosophy that the Stoics assimilated. It comes from a famous poem called The Golden Verses of Pythagoras. And Seneca mentions this, Epictetus quotes it, and Galen, Marcus Aurelius's physician, writes about this in relation to Stoicism. Galen actually said he reads the poem aloud twice a day, the Golden Verses. It's not that long. It probably takes 5 or 10 minutes to read aloud. But there's a part of it that says, don't allow your eyes to close each evening until you've reviewed the events of the day 3 times and asked yourself what you did well, what you did badly, and what you could do differently next time. So that's what I would call a learning cycle. Like, it's a process of self-mentoring or self-therapy. Epictetus and Seneca recommend doing that part of it. And so we try and do that. That provides a framework or a structure for other practices. So each day I would try to do things that are consistent with my values, and then at the end of the day I review how I got on, and I think about, what could I maybe do differently tomorrow. Then there are a bunch of other things that I would fit into that, but that's the basic idea.
Well, that's terrific. And I'm excited to apply more of that daily review to my day as well. Thank you so much for your time today. And I think we're about out of time here, but where can people find you on social media and connect with your work?
If they look at my website, it's just donaldrobertson.name. So it's just my name, all one word. And then instead of .com, it says .name. And if you go there, it connects to all of my social media. And so I've got a lot of articles that I write online. I have a whole publication on Medium. I looked the other day to count how many writers we've got, and I think it was like 40. And hundreds of articles. I didn't even realize that we had so much. So I have a publication, we have 40 writers on it, and some of them are well-known writers like John Sellers and Massimo Pellucci and other people that write books. So I do a lot of writing online, and I run online courses they can find via my website. The online courses that I run, many of which are just free, so people can go on, and there's a little crash course in Stoicism or a crash course in Socrates they can do that only takes about 10 minutes if they want to know what to do next.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and look forward to chatting again soon, hopefully. Thank you so much, Donald.
Thank you. No problem. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.